All right. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Happy Sunday to you. Afternoon, evening, wherever it is you are. I am Spencer Campbell, aka Gila RPGs. Thank you all for your patience. We had a heck of a time figuring it out, but we figured it out. Uh, this is Coffee Break. I'm so excited. Coffee Break is my weekly hangout show where I sit down and chat with friends and amazing people in the indie RPG scene. And today I am joined by Vince Smith. I am so dang excited to be sitting here with Vince. Vince, would you mind taking a second to introduce yourself to folks?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, y'all. I'm Vince, aka Dichotomous Prime. If you already know me by now, you probably know me from being irreverent and irascible on Twitter about a number of different topics, whether it be RPG design, social justice related things, and yelling at checkmarks who get too big for their britches. And basically that. But also, in my other time, I maintain a blog over on Ko-fi where I talk about things like narrative design, mechanics design, social justice related things. And there are a number of different kind of publicly available ones. There are ones for like subscriber cool exclusive stuff. And I've also worked on the RPGs Unconquered and the Mnemonic Weaver's Almanac, making cool stuff like magic systems and things like that.
Heck yeah. I just threw Vince's link tree in chat for folks who want to go see where all that very cool stuff is. Um, when I sit down with folks, you know, I don't think of this as like an interview show, but just like sitting around shooting the shit. By the way, you can swear if you want to swear.
Oh God, well, I'm super glad. It's just like, what up, motherfuckers? It's Sunday
coming
morning.
in hot.
Yeah, exactly.
Whenever I do this, I like to sit down and like think, when did I first like see this person or interact with this person? And I definitely first found you on Twitter through the tabletop chop shop tag. Um,
Mhm.
which was like, can you explain the tag for folks who might not have heard it or seen it before?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, I a couple of I forget, I believe that it was 2 summers ago. Myself and a number of different kind of creators in the space, Nick Butler, who created Tidebreaker, CD Huanzan, Monkey's Paw Games, aka Nora Rose, a bunch of us kind of had this idea, and at least for me, just kind of a lot of us were, as indie RPG creators usually are, exhausted by the monopoly of D&D in the space. And part of kind of the hypothesis that I had is that part of the reason why D&D maintains that monopoly among creators, at least, is that there's 30 plus years of infrastructure surrounding, like, if you're a GM, and what are GMs but fledgling designers?
Mm.
There are forums and blog posts and, like, updates from Jared Crawford on how rulings work and all of these other things that, like, if you have a question about how do I balance X, there's an answer for you. But for almost everything else, there isn't that. And so there's a lack of I guess, game design literacy, or thinking about things in a sort of modular or breaking things down way to create player experiences and all that sort of stuff. And essentially, we wanted to create that hashtag. At least that was kind of my approach to it, in order to start those conversations and go like, listen, designing, there is nothing fundamentally different between you and Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins, just because they make, like, them making 6 digits a year does not mean that they are better designers than you.
Mm.
You can do what they do and you can probably do it better. The only difference is that, like, they have access to infrastructure and resources that you don't. So the idea of making it less scary and getting people kind of talking about, well, okay, I had this really cool experience with this game. but why did I have that really cool experience? And part of that is always going to be, you know, having a good group, having good communication, having a good GM if you are playing a game with a GM, that sort of thing. But part of that, and a large part of it, is curated through the way that you design a game and the structures and the tools that you choose and the things that you choose to omit and that sort of thing. And breaking those things down in a way that is more easily parsed by people who are just getting started, so that the default isn't trying to make D&D work for everything, because it can't, and just kind of going essentially the path of least resistance. So yeah, that was kind of the origins of that. And now a lot of the time it's like, if someone has some noodling designs on tabletop stuff, I'll a lot of the time I'll quote retweet it with like a tabletop chop shop thing.
Right.
So that if you search that and you're a fledgling designer being like, I don't know where to start, it can be like, cool, here's a bunch of people who have been doing this sort of thing for a long time with varying different levels of influence and whatnot, who are maybe asking similar questions. And even if you don't have a clear answer that you get from it, you at least have a direction that you can start to move in that respect.
Yeah, I think it's very cool to see folks who are so open and willing to have like just the like, here's my stream of consciousness thoughts on design and sharing of the you know, our own design philosophies and everything like that. I see, you know, we see cool things with like people releasing like director's cuts or design commentary versions of their games to get you know, to show you the tools that they used or the thought process that they used. The Chop Shop tag is especially cool, I think, as a like focusing point, because I have done so many like threads where I just whatever, I just vomit out all of my mechanical thoughts about something, and then they don't really, like, it doesn't really go anywhere and it's meandering. But like having it under something like the tabletop chop shop, which is not easy to say fast, I'm realizing, it's a nice sort of like centralized place. Like, let's just like look at some design thoughts for the day is very cool.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because people who have been following me for a while might notice that I've had fewer of like the 20 plus tweet threads of that sort of thing, because there's definitely a couple of different, I don't want to say formulae, but like types of structure that those take. Because sometimes, and especially as someone who is autistic and has ADHD, a lot of the time it's like I'm writing it out so that I can figure out what the thing is that I'm trying to make. And like that sort of like kind of diegesis is also just kind of a part of the design process for a lot of us. But if I'm talking more on a specific topic, I've started to realize that, you know, a structured sort of blog post or article where I can actually write out my notes, and like it's funny because my design process looks almost exactly like my like article writing process.
Okay.
In that I have a Google Doc, and I go under a number of different headings. I go like, you know, okay, what are we writing here? What's the point we're trying to make? Okay, what are the things that we're using to try and make that point? Because I always think like, you know, thing with ADHD that I always think about is how I describe my internal kind of monologue as, imagine you have an apartment in a building with really shitty walls where you can hear every other conversation going on at the same time, to where it's really hard to just kind of get a word in edgewise and kind of like isolate a single thought. But the nice thing, and this is also why I write things down analog rather than like digitally writing them down first, is because I can think like 1,000 different thoughts at once, and it's really tough to deal with, but I can only write one thing at a time.
Right.
So it's just like, okay, well, we're going to isolate everything down to what this is. And it's kind of the same way of talking about like game design, which well, for the longest time, when I have a really good experience of a piece of media, it'll be like, wow, I'm really enjoying this, or this really didn't hit it for me. But then the next thought that happens is, okay, but why am I enjoying this so much? Okay, but why do I dislike this so much? And then I feel like that curiosity a lot of the times is the root of, even if not making your own stuff, just like analysis and understanding of different things.
Yeah, I mean, I have caught some of your streams of playing like Monster Hunter or other things like that, and it's so fun to watch you play these games because you will stop and pause and think about it and talk about why you're enjoying something or why something isn't resonating with you. And it's I think it's especially fascinating for me to watch because it's the complete opposite of how I engage with video games, where
Oh, interesting. Okay.
video games are my I'm turning my brain off time where I'm like, I do not want to think about anything.
100% valid, honestly. And to be honest, there are some times where I wish I could do that.
It's so, but then I watch people like you doing these like I watch you talking about like Horizon or something like that, and I'm just going like, there's so much more going on, and if I just took a breath and like and thought about it, it's I love it. It's so cool to see the sort of stream of consciousness sort of stuff. It's so my background, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and so
Oh, interesting. Okay, because my background is in psychology and philosophy.
excellent. All right, fellow psych friend. Um, my very good friend in grad school, her primary means of research was doing think aloud protocols while kids would read fables.
Right.
And so every sentence or so, they were encouraged to kind of stop reading the story and just kind of like say what you're thinking. And it could be totally unrelated to the story. It's just whatever is on your mind. And it's fascinating the trends of thoughts that you get from kids reading fables. But like the think aloud process in general is a really valuable source, and I think that's what you're kind of capturing via the stream of consciousness streams, where you are just like, here's what I'm thinking right now, and I love that.
It's kind of interesting because the think aloud protocols, or like, you'll probably, I don't know how familiar your audience will be with it, but like thought records, for instance, ended up being like I've been through therapy a number of different times, and like kind of dealing with like, ADHD, depression, all that kind of different stuff. And just kind of, that was a really big thing that helped me, primarily because like things like mindfulness don't quite work when you can't separate one thought from another. So it just feels like trying to meditate in a room full of bees, and it doesn't quite work because you're like, fucking stop it, and you're just like, they're constantly harassing you. But when you can kind of write down like, okay, specifically, what am I feeling right now? Positive, negative, how intensely am I feeling it right now? And kind of go like boop, 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 boop. And being able to break it down with that kind of modularity, kind of, and it's interesting because I never really made that connection until now. Kind of was almost the burgeoning part of it, because, for a long time I've been like a very analytical kid and overthinking everything. Like I said, can't really turn it off.
Right.
And like, when I was in high school, I like wrote movie reviews for like the local newspaper, and like I was really big into film critique for a really long time. And like, I was the kid, like the person who got me into comic books, for instance, was the one of the librarians at my high school, because I was the kid who would hang out with the librarians at lunch. And like, we would just kind of like chat, and dude literally lent me like the first 20 volumes of Ultimate Spider-Man, and it was just like, he would hand me 3 volumes and I would finish it in a day and come back, and he would be like, cool, all right, ready for the next ones? Okay, cool. And I would grab it and I would finish it in a night, and we would do that. And I would like lend him Transmetropolitan and like Preacher and like, a bunch of the different kind of DC Vertigo stuff that I was reading. And the discussion that kind of came from that, again, kind of like informed the further ability to kind of have that conversation rather than just kind of like, I think this sucks. Is like, that's valid, but like more importantly, let's talk about why you think that it sucks.
Right.
Because you can't convince someone that a thing that you think sucks is actually good from an individual experience perspective. Like, and this is a thing that makes film critique nerds very upset when you say it, and like things of like with respect to video games, is that you might be able to convince someone that they hadn't considered a certain dimension of a thing, but if someone's experience of a thing is like, I just didn't have that good experience myself, you can't logic them into enjoying something. Which is interesting because I feel like a lot of the constructs surrounding game design and things like that is shaping in an almost very operant way the kind of like, okay, we shape this experience in this sort of direction and we give these kinds of incentives and kind of like, frame the situation in this sort of way. And you can't do that in a universal thing, which is also why I have my whole rant on like, no, D&D can't be everything. Imagination can be everything, but D&D and imagination are not the same thing. As much as the branding arm of Wizards of the Coast would like them to be the same thing.
Right.
The game design and storytelling broadly is about making choices, and you can't like just be like, well, I choose everything and it can be anything. It's like, well, you can do that with your imagination, absolutely, and that's why I think that anyone can be a designer. Right. Like I'm very big like, you too can be a hero sort of thing, because there is not some kind of special talent that makes you able or not able to design a thing, because you've been telling stories ever since the first time that you got in trouble as a kid and had to make up something to convince your parent why you didn't get in, why you shouldn't be punished. And ultimately, like, there's storytelling and then there's writing and then there's game design, and all of these different things are just different palette sets of tools that you can use to convey things. And I feel like the unique challenge surrounding game design is that you are giving tools to hand to someone else, and you are giving up a certain degree of authorship to go, all right, well, I'm going to hand you this set of tools that's good for these subsets of stories. However, I don't know what kind of stories you're going to tell with them. However, what I can do is I can maybe curate and tell you, like, these tools are good for this. They're not super good for this other thing. And I feel as though that requires a certain amount of creative honesty. But if you have a certain thing that's just like, hey, at some point I'm going to stop picking on D&D in this conversation,
no,
but
right.
Just because of the amount of space they take up, that if you are coming at something from an economical and commerce-centric perspective, I don't think that creative honesty is there, because ultimately that turns into you're telling people not to buy your product. And that's just like, that's a thing that's not really going to fly if that's your primary concern. Like, we could also pick on like Daniel Fox and Zweihander also as an example of that. Like, if we're gonna like just to basically take the boot off of Watsy's neck for 2 seconds, like, yeah, exactly. Don't worry, we'll get back there later. But like, there are a certain number of curated tools that you can hand to someone, but because of like one being a responsible designer with things like not including things that could be like very harmful, like, mechanics for, let's say, sexual assault or just something horrible, basically, then that's also like a choice to not include that, because basically it maybe not removes that framing, because people have free will, and if someone really, really wants to include racism in their game, I'm just going to not interact with that person, and there's no game design decision that could stop them. But it's still kind of a matter of framing different things and giving people certain tools to do certain things. But anyways, I've been talking for 5 minutes straight, so please, by all means.
Well, I mean, I love it. First of all, again, stream of consciousness. I'm all for it. I absorb it, and it's fantastic. Um, I have to just say, unrelated to everything that you just said, because it hit me early on. I have to say I have a great appreciation for your metaphors and analogies that you use. With the meditating with bees in a room full of bees, it's very evocative. I understand exactly what you're getting at. And the reason I appreciate it so much is that I studied, so my PhD is in text and discourse processing. So it's about
Oh, interesting. Okay.
language processing, the what's going on with the brain as we read these interesting little squiggles on the screen and turn them into words and stuff.
Mhm.
Specifically, I studied in the realm of non-literal language, so metaphors, idioms, metonyms, things like that. So I always
Mhm.
have to just whenever somebody uses a particularly good metaphor or something, I have to go, I appreciate that, because
Mhm.
I spent way too much of my life studying them, and so
Could you tell me what a metonym is? I don't believe I'm familiar with that term.
yeah, so I love metonyms. Metonyms are an example, is like Washington wants to raise your taxes. Washington is a metonym where a single word represents like a larger base, like a collective of things or a whole host of things. So it's not that Washington wants to raise your taxes, it's that the House and Senate and Congress and President and everybody else who are involved with the process, or to like if you are at a restaurant and you refer to a customer based off of the order that they have, like the ham sandwich at the counter wants more coffee. The ham sandwich is representing this
Gotcha.
person.
Yeah, a collective or an abstraction sort of thing.
Exactly. I love a good
It,
old metonym.
it's interesting because I don't know if you know on Twitter John East at
Hmm.
Yes John.
Yeah.
Yeah. They studied linguistics among other things, and recommended me the book The Unfolding of Language
Mm.
by a guy. I'm gonna murder his last name, Guy Duscher. Um, and it was really interesting to read because a big part of the thing that he talks about is how so many of our like metaphors and things like that, or not even necessarily like metaphors presently, but ways of speaking
Hmm.
began life as metaphors and then previously, before then, started it as literal terms for physical phenomenon.
Mm.
But they became so frequently used that they became dead metaphors because people
Yes.
forgot that they were metaphors in the first place.
Hmm.
Like the idea that let's see. Congress erupted in conflict is like Congresses don't erupt.
Right.
Congresses of people argue, but volcanoes erupt, geysers erupt, like that sort of thing. And you don't really, and it seems very kind of like queenie to really kind of like get into it. It's like, well, technically, it's like yes, 300, 400 years later, that is a very kind of like pedantic thing to do. But, those things have real roots that existed. Like to say that the word like being thrilled by something.
Mm.
And this is more present in the UK expression thrilled to bits. To be a thrill it's kind of a form of like drilling or like dissecting something, like it's a physical tool that you would use to pierce something.
Right.
And you can see the roots of that in the way that people talk about it, but we don't talk about it because it's now several centuries and a few countries removed from its original usage. But I think that exploring not only the actuality of that origin, but also the process by which things are abstracted and change over time is very useful for understanding not just that but other phenomenon. For instance, one of the more recent subscriber exclusive things that I did for Kofi was an article on what I call visual touchstones, which is basically the idea that there are certain things in films and TV and things like that that you just look at and you have an implicit
Mm.
feeling that a thing is about to happen, that is usually related to a trope, a genre, something like that, or a narrative beat. One of the examples that I used was the badass person cracks their neck or cracks their knuckles. And it was interesting because I started doing some research for it. And each of these things has an initial usage that popularized a certain trope. The cracking the neck and cracking the knuckles most likely was popularized by the fight scene between Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee in one of their movies. But at the beginning of that fight scene, each of them does like an extended warm up while like, you know, they kind of remove their their gi shirt, and like it's a whole extended thing. But then you see an uptick in that precedence of that particular trope over the series of years, and it gets smaller and smaller, but the consistency of the context in which it appears carries through the original meaning of it, which is, Morpheus is fighting Neo, like, there is about to be a throwdown for some reason. And even when those things are inverted, like I use the example of episode 3 of the Netflix series Arcane, where Vi, this scrappy teenager is fighting with this huge tattooed like bad guy enforcer, and he walks up to her on the bridge and he cracks his neck, and then she just shoryukens him into like another lifetime, and he goes down in one hit. And the thing is why that inversion works is because it sets the expectation that this person is intimidating and a bruiser and formidable, and then uses that expectation to invert it by immediately, normally if that person loses, they lose in a very kind of close fight and really gives the hero a run for their money. The fact that they don't in this scene is significant. And all of that started from reading The Unfolding of Language and talking about the evolution of dead metaphors and the coral reef of language that grows over top of them. So,
I love dead metaphors. I remember reading Lakoff and Johnson a long time ago, back in undergrad. It was my first exposure to dead metaphors. My go-to example and this is an example that then doesn't require even necessarily centuries, is Blockbuster, right? We use the word blockbuster as like a smashing success at the box office, but a blockbuster previously was a bomb meant to devastate a city block, and we have changed it, and we never use the word blockbuster in that form anymore, but it has now grown. And then dead metaphors, exactly like you said, they're a coral reef. They expand. Things grow on top of it. That's a big realm of my research, is the sort of like clustering of metaphors and the shifting of how one processes them as they go from highly novel to the range of conventional to all the way to dead. I have not had a chance to talk about this stuff or nerd out on this stuff in a long time, so I'm highly appreciative of it. I'm into it.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, and this is something that I've talked a little bit with Burst of Hope, Jess over at Utopia about, is getting to talk to people about the nerdy stuff that they don't normally get the opportunity to talk about is also one of my favorite things, because, like, for instance, like, everyone hears like Brutal Dan, like Danny over on Twitter, talk about like board games and like, representation and things like that. And everyone hears like, Abria Iyengar talk about like GMing and all of that sort of stuff. But like, Abria is also was just below Olympic level athlete when she was in college. And like, I think that, and I hope I remember this correctly, she was like sidelined by an injury, and so like didn't really get a chance to do it. And I'm like, I want to know about that. Like, what's the thing that you never get a chance to rant about that you want to like I want to learn that about you. I want to hear Danny talk about like nutrition and like, just kind of like posterior chain and like mobility related things related to fitness, as well as like all of these sorts of things and assumptions and things surrounding like diet culture and like fat phobia, in addition to all of this other stuff. Because I feel as though, because a lot of the time social media is about kind of branding and what do people associate with you when they like go to your page or whatever, and it shrinks a lot of people down to a couple of like data points of like, this person's a designer, Vince is a bully, you know, all of this sort of stuff, but you never really get that chance to fully realize your experience of like a person's complete nature. And that's why I tend to enjoy things like podcasts. But even then, like, you know, when people market a podcast, a lot of the time they're like, you know, well, this is a podcast about bit and bit. And like, so the things tend to orient around what someone is known for. And so, but I think, you know, again, this kind of is the ADHD curiosity in me, which is like, I hear like a thing that doesn't quite fit the pattern and I immediately zoom in on it. I'm like, okay, but what about that? Like, it's very Columbo, and just kind of, to not date myself with a fucking metaphor from the 80s. But and it's also kind of like why I'm particularly proficient at like sussing out patterns that unfortunately, like, you know, patterns of like, that's going to turn into a cult personality thing, and in about 6 months we're going to get a shitty story about like person X doing Y. But unfortunately, and this sounds like a humble brag, but I really don't mean it as one, is like I'll do the like, you know, the redcoats are coming thing, and people will be like, what? But this person's such a like nice person. I'm like, okay, but consider this, and this, that there's like kind of this omission of this on these situations, and you just kind of like watch the landscape and these patterns form in this certain way. And like, it seems like an exaggeration until you like 6 months down the road, it's like, oh, right, it's that thing. But because I feel like the long game picture, especially with the amount of overload that social media and things throw at people, makes it difficult for people to kind of like pick up on the like, we've been here before, this keeps happening, and like, you know, the positivity game of that sort of thing, encouraging people to just kind of let it happen again, is just, when you do that like hyper condensed over a couple of months, people maybe pick up on it. But when it's like 6 months, 8 months, a year, people kind of don't necessarily see it as like parts of the same landscape, unless you have someone who spends a bunch of time to collate a lot of those data points and come up with something cogent. So yeah, it's kind of, it's a blessing and a curse, because I feel like the same pattern recognition in terms of people's experiences, positive or negative, is also what allows me to put together a mechanic that's like, okay, but let me make an engine that, like, if you put the right kinds of fuel in it, reproduce relatively reliably these kinds of experiences that people associate with a superhero game, or like, you know, the creativity of making your own magic spell and things like that. But then it's also like, you know, you kind of see these things, but it kind of can be relatively isolating a lot of the time, unfortunately, because there are certain patterns that people are very much incentivized to not want to see.
Yeah. We were having a very similar sort of conversation about this in the Gila RPGs Discord this morning, about the TTRPG family hashtag, and it makes my skin crawl. It makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, very much. And it's the thing that gets me, because that's kind of the like entry point, is that skin crawling feeling of like, I don't know if I trust this. And then kind of the next tier up is I start looking for the people whose brand is very much that, who are going like, who are then saying, well, this is kind of like creepy and I don't know if I trust it. But then there's an inconsistency there with the still like choices of vocabulary that they use, because like you may not be using the TTRPG family, but you talk about like, hey friends, and like all of this sort of stuff, and I love you all, and that sort of thing. And it's like, even if you're not saying it explicitly, those things are still conveying a very specific type of relationship, which, like, you know, you can do that, but like, don't be surprised if then people ask you for a level of connection and assume that you are closer in friendship than a parasocial relationship would otherwise intend, because you cannot sell people on your product using love and friendship and connection and then expect them to not want that from you.
Right.
And I feel as though there is a very large part, and like, you know, frankly, very white part of the community, though not always, that will very much lean into the like ooh woo, like soft family sort of thing, but then also try and like have it both ways in the like, I'm outspoken unless it's someone who actually has influence or power in the space, and then it's like complete silence.
Right.
Like I don't want to say I popularized it, but like I use the term 1XP rats to refer to racists in the comments who are first name lots of numbers, because basically there's this thing that I find where influential accounts will take pride in shouting down racists with no power in the replies of people who made their account last week, and then make a huge show about quote retweeting it and dunking it in front of a whole bunch of their followers.
Right.
But then the more subtle ways that actually perpetuate a lot more harm than, like, you know, Slapnut69 who made their account 2 weeks ago, people who own discords, people who decide who gets hired and who doesn't, people who greenlight huge campaigns that are based off of cultural appropriation and things like that, who exclude people of color and queer people and like put disabled people at risk. All of those people, like, you don't hear that about, and then you start hearing things about like negativity and tearing people down. That's kind of another one of those things that it's like, you know, you going into the replies and farming 1XP rats does not impress me. It's like, because it's very much a like, you risk exactly nothing,
right,
and you accomplish exactly nothing but reinforcing your brand to an audience that, look how much of an ally I am. And it's just kind of like, allies speak truth to power. If the only people that you are willing to speak truth from are people who like would not threaten like your power in the, that's not really allyship. That's not enacting allyship. And that's something that I find a lot, not just in tabletop RPGs, but it's more a matter of, because there is such a bottleneck of influence, once you get beyond, I'm going to say, 5,000 followers on Twitter or something like that, just to put an arbitrary number on it, it starts kind of being a lot of like, you can name a dozen people and like, that's who, like, you will know their names and faces, and like that is who you will know. And then you get above 10K and that shrinks to about 8 to 10 people, and then you like get above 50K and it's about like the same amount. And it's just this, you know, in a lot of very broad things, like for instance the video game industry, people like good friend and awesome person Pleasantly Twisted will opt to talk a lot about topics rather than people, because these things are so widespread, and I think that that's a very useful way to talk about things in a lot of scenarios. When it comes to employment and wages and things like that, with respect to especially the, what I'll clumsily call the upper echelon of tabletop games, I start talking about people. And the reason why I start talking about people is because the influence in terms of who gets to like control those gates and everything becomes very, very bottlenecked, even if not like formally in terms of like, this person's the CEO or president of blah, 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 blah. There's still like a very concentrated number of people that like know a lot of those people and be like, you shouldn't work with that person. And and like immediately that person is like, why is everyone just ghosting me all of a sudden? And I feel as though those people are not John 3645 MAGA 420 like in the replies. They are people who know and are savvy enough to impression manage. Like they know to not say the quiet part loud, and they know how to convey certain media brands. But because it's not overt and super obvious until like someone messes up, people, it'll just happen. And as long as they know how to say the right things, they'll let that happen. Adam Coble is an example. Brandon Dixon, Swordsfall is another example. Like, you know the keys to press and you know the mouth sounds to make. And a lot of the time, because of the overflow of like information that people get, but then also there's a certain like people are averse to conflict. They don't really want to actively engage that because, to be fair, the world is exhausting and it is work to do that. But enacting allyship is work, and doing the right thing is work. And unfortunately, there is no easy answer to, but who's safe in the TTRPG industry? Can someone just put in the replies your creators who you know are safe? It's like, I don't know how to tell this to you, but there is no like easy list that allows you to turn your brain off and go, okay, these are the people who I can trust. You have to look into it. You have to. And that's an unfortunate reality.
Yeah, first of all, once again, great metaphor with the 1 XP rats. Gotta shout out that because that's wonderful. Yeah, it's with the, especially when you at that last point you said of like, is there a nice list or something like that? I've been seeing that a lot on Twitter lately of people who are asking like, okay, who should I be following that is quote unquote the right people to be following or something like that. And like that coupled with Follow Fridays, where it's just like a bombardment of lists where that's how the bad actors get slipped in and then associated with 12 other people who are not associated with that name. Like, you couple those two things together and it's a nightmare, right? And it truly is then just becomes this mindless clicking and farming of the followers and things like that. So it is just like, oh, this person I know said that these people are safe. I'm gonna just say they're all safe then, and I'll be happy. And these are the right people to be following.
Influence, and if I can have a single thing that people take away from me in terms of a saying on this, influence is not a surrogate for critical thinking. You cannot farm out your savvy of investigating and making informed decisions to someone based off of how many followers they have. You can't do it. I don't care how many people say that they're an amazing human being. If their actions follow that description, then you'll find that out when you look into what they're doing and the consistency or inconsistency with what they do. But there is no surrogate for your critical thinking. You can't hand that to someone else and be like, you do this for me.
Right.
And it can be tempting to do that. And a lot of the times it's because everyone's exhausted. Everyone is like repeatedly being traumatized and everything like that. But if your priority is wanting to make just decisions, those are things that you have to invest time into. There's no finish line. There are times. One thing that was brought up to me during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, great timing with Black History Month and everything, is learn to rest, not to quit. And the reason for that is that there is no finish line. There's no time where you're like, okay, the credits roll and everything is happily ever after. Is like there isn't a point at which that happens. There's always another thing, and that doesn't mean that every day you suit up and do it and you like wear yourself down to a bloody nub. I've had to learn that lesson very much because I'm big like Kirishima from like My Hero Academia energy, to where like I want to be the shield for everyone. And that's why, like, I'll hop into a Brian W. Foster's mentions and be like, fucking come at me. I will destroy you and all of you. And I don't know if you've noticed, but he hasn't been doing Talks Mach anymore, but, you know, but, you know, we'll just kind of leave that at that. But I've had to learn, like, you don't have to take on every fight, and ultimately not resting in doing that is a form of self-harm and also makes you worse at helping people.
Yeah.
But by that same token, the way to do it is also not completely shut down and farm out that, like, decision-making process to someone because a bunch of people said, like, they're an amazing being and everyone should follow them, as it's just like, that's not how being a human being works,
right.
Unfortunately. And let's see, ARBCO, let's see, or no, it was Bad Quail who was saying it's better to be an accomplice than an ally. And that's, I definitely feel that. The thing that I have shifted my thinking in is that I don't talk about being an ally or being an accomplice because, and you'll probably appreciate this as, like, you know, a cognitive psychologist and someone who has studied language, because both of those things are adjectives, whereas both of those, in my opinion, the best way to kind of go about those things is thinking of them as verbs. Right. You're not being an ally, you are enacting allyship. Like, you are, in what ways can you be an accomplice? Because that's a thing that you have to wake up every day and make the decision to do. A lot of people, like, for instance, you'll see someone who puts ally in their bio and then be really fucking racist, and, like, all of that sort of thing. But if they go Black Lives Matter and then the actions don't line up, then it doesn't really matter what that person says. Like, there's kind of, like, the whole thing where, like, anytime critical role is brought up for, like, racism and, like, you know, cultural appropriation and things like that, people will go, but they are amazing allies. And it's like, I feel like part of that is a symptom of people making that a badge or a part of their identity, rather than just, like, that's an action that you choose to do every day. And, like, what is trust but an ultimately a positive risk assessment that someone will live up to what they say they're going to do. And I think that thinking of it in terms of actions rather than, like, this is a static trait that a person has, because a person who can be, like, very just in one arena can do some awful shit in another arena, for instance. Let's see, there have definitely been, just, like, say, people who, like, fight for representation of, like, you know, a certain marginalized group, but who are really, really bigoted against another marginalized group. And I feel as though, because there's this very unified idea of, like, this person's an ally or that sort of thing, that when those things having to do with intersectionality come up, people have a lot of trouble parsing that and going, like, because they're thinking of, like, well, is this person a good person or is this person a bad person? And it's like, the answer to that question is less important than the fact that that is the wrong question. And the question is, like, the thing that they did over here is good. However, this thing is still bad, and furthermore, you don't balance one against the other. You say, this thing was bad and this thing is good. And then depending on how they decide to react continuously, like, if they own it, if they, like, make recompense to the group who was harmed, and if they do that, then that group, and that group specifically, can decide whether or not that person is worthy of that forgiveness. But this whole thing of, like, morality and justice is not a ledger that you try and stay in the black. It's just an ongoing thing that you do, and you are evaluated based off of those, like, because everyone will mess up, but, like, how you react and own or not own that mess up and, like, seek to do the right thing is ultimately what will kind of determine where you're at and how you're approaching this. Is it about you, or is it about the people who you are trying to help or give the things that they are asking for rather than you deciding for them.
I see this a lot in academia, this idea of universities, because I teach at a university, so at the university level, schools wanting to label themselves as allies and things like that, and that they have a commitment to diversity or you know or anything like that, and then it's the follow through is just it's never there, right? So like for example, one of the biggest things that we see in a lot of higher education institutions is you will see a push in hiring a diverse faculty, like increasing diversity in your faculty body, and then great, checked that off, and then there's no structure in place for retention of
Yeah.
the diverse faculty. So that inevitably, 2, 3 years out, they burn out, they have no support, they're gone, and so we just have to go back. Well, look, we hired 3 more professors of color, and you're like, well, but what happened to the ones that you got 3 years ago? Where are
Yeah,
they?
exactly. A thing that I notice, and this is very much kind of present in a lot of the same spaces that we inhabit, is the term is diversity, equity, and inclusion. But anytime that you see an actual statement on it, a lot of the time it's like diverse, inclusive spaces. It'll be like, so what? I remember there being an E in there. I
Yes.
remember there being an E in there somewhere. Could you please answer me as to where that E went? Please answer quickly. Like, and that's the thing that like had to do with like when Critical Role was talking about like their Marquette campaign or whatever, and being like, we hired diversity consultants, or like the thing having to do with the game Sifu right now is another example
Yeah.
of like, we hired cultural consultants. Like, yes, but here's the thing: you hired them after the thing was already decided that you were going to make that as like a full like all white developer on both of these projects. They didn't have like decision making. The only thing that they could maybe do is contribute to it being less harmful. And even then, the thing about being a cultural consultant or sensitivity reader is that the people you work for don't have to actually enact your recommendations. Like, so a lot of the time, and I talked about this during the Horizon Zero Dawn playthrough, is that what cultural consultants end up being is compensated consent to the people, so that they can be like, okay, but we're going to pay you a certain amount to stamp not racist on our project. And then when people decide to criticize it, we can go, we hired a cultural consultant and they said it was okay. And it's like, well, of course they said that it was okay, because they like, you paid them to do it. And in a lot of the time, the only spaces and positions on these projects, they're not writers, they're certainly not directors, they're certainly not project managers, they're consultants. So it's that or don't get hired at all. And that's kind of the main problem. I'm no longer impressed with places that want to tell me we have a cultural consultant. It's like, cool, where are not just one but several writers of color, several queer and trans people of color, several disabled people of color on your teams? Because even just having one, that one person isn't going to represent the whole of like marginalized experiences, no matter how many marginalized identities they fall in the intersection of. Because one person is not diverse, a team is diverse. And like, you make that decision when you start the project. It's the same thing that we were talking about yesterday when I made a thread about workers' wages in TTRPGs and like per word rates. And, I mean, that's per word rates. There's a whole other problem with that, but that's another conversation. Where you decide at the start of your project that you are going to pay people equitably. and then you decide how large of a project you can afford based off of those wages. When all of those things are after the fact, like, they become kind of squeezed into the margins, and hence, people who are marginalized and they never fully get any kind of executive control over these projects or decision making or any of these sorts of things. And just, these are things that when I bring them up to people directly, rather than just very kind of generalized threads that influential people can look at and be like, oh, well, thank goodness that's not us. That's bad, but thank goodness that we're not in that picture. Spoilers, they were, in fact, in that picture. Then you get brought up on negativity and like all of these sorts of stuff, and you get called a bully. It's like, no, I'm bringing this to you because you are the person with the money who is making these decisions. And like, until that leadership changes, nothing changes.
Right. It's the point.
And absolutely loot the room. I absolutely believe that those people get used as shields.
Yeah, Chris, 100% on that. It's really interesting, that point you made earlier of like, what's that that middle letter that oftentimes gets dropped, the equity side of things. It's interesting. So I won't get into specifics just because, but so my partner is also an educator, teaches at a high school level. So I'm at college level, she's at high school level. Both schools doing big work in DEI right now. My school kind of getting started with it, and hers has been doing it forever because they have probably the most diverse student body I've ever seen, which is very cool, but not in faculty.
Right.
And so it's really interesting. She said something to me last year, and it has stuck with me, which is like, your school, Spencer, is focused on the first letter, diversity. When you have to just realize that diversity already exists, right? Like that's the reality. So it's, you don't need a committee for that, right? You need to start moving on to the next parts here. And that's been something that has stuck in my head because, yeah, absolutely, that's there. So what you need the other parts to like foster it or to maintain it. Going back to that sense of like horrible retention rates for faculty of color at higher ed level and things like that, right? Like, they're there. We just don't keep them because it's a completely inequitable situation for them. There's zero support.
Right.
So,
and I feel as though kind of in conjunction with like why representation is important but wholly insufficient in and of itself is guy who's the newest mayor of New York, who's a former cop. Like, every gentleman is black. Everything that I hear out of that mouth is fasci speak. And it's that thing of like, yeah, you can't checkmark hire someone based solely off of their membership in a group and be like, okay, done, we're good. But unfortunately, neoliberalism and kind of this like center left sort of thing has turned diversity into a sort of currency. And you'll see it when, for instance, an example from the whole Swords Fall thing of like, there was an example where Swords Fall like misgendered a non-binary person. And someone in the replies was going like, yeah, he misgendered a non-binary, disabled, like all of this sort of stuff. And you'll see it when people will start listing out like the different sorts of things. And it's like, okay, so, and this feels like a nitpicking thing, but since we were talking about like language and what language is used for, the way that those additional marginalizations is being used in that scenario is as a currency to go, it would be bad enough if this person misgendered this non-binary person, which it is, 100%, no debate about that. However, it's extra bad because this person belongs to this group and this group and this group. And the reason why that's not a good way to frame things is that people who do have the savvy to be able to use that, when they like, say, when someone like a Natalie Wynn ContraPoints does something really fucking like racist or transphobic, people can go, oh, you want to come after a queer trans woman? Okay, misogynist and all of that sort of thing. And like, people are able to kind of like cash that out only because it's placed as currency, and only because the only reason they're able to do that is because of that overemphasis on diversity rather than like equity and inclusion. Because when you start getting to equity and inclusion, it means you're going to have multiple people in the room, and there's going to be multiple perspectives of those various different experiences, multiple intersections and things like that. And we start talking about like the principles that underlie social justice movements, rather than just, well, okay, we put together a Benetton ad or a Captain Planet looking team worth of people, and we're good, right? It's like, yeah, but all of those people are libertarians, but they're Asian libertarians. Like, and it's just kind of like, okay, but it doesn't super matter if like your team is Andrew Yang, Terry Crews, and like, you know, all of these people who don't really give a shit about any of those topics anyways. Like, it's
a nightmare dream team.
Yeah, exactly. It's just kind of like, you know, through our powers combined, we are capitalism planet. Like, all right, great, amazing.
Oh no, the worst planet.
Yeah.
Oh, Noop Soup, I think, is intersectionality, dismantling your diversity one step at a time.
Yeah, it's, and that's the thing, is it's like, it's tough to have these conversations because a lot of the time it is this very, you know how we were talking about, like, you know, farming out your critical thinking skills and simplifying them down to, you know, I should listen to this person, or these are the things that I should say and think, and kind of like repeating these log lines and things like that, rather than directly engaging the topic at hand and all of those sorts of things, is that it's placed people in a very like Justice 101 sort of position where people are not super prepared to have those conversations. And if you kind of reply to it in that way, or like kind of bring up as like, yes, but this person is also really homophobic, be like, oh, okay, so you want to shout down insert my marginalization. And it's like, if there was a pattern, and we come back to patterns as we were talking about earlier, if there was a pattern where suddenly this person only wants to talk about homophobia when it's black people, which is a thing that happens a lot, then we can talk about someone like, that's suspicious. We start giving that person a side eye real hard. But the criticism that like don't support homophobic people doesn't go away if that person belongs to another minority, or is even like a gay person, Pete Buttigieg being an example. But there isn't that level of like nuance with it, because the discourse ends at, I should support this person. Right. I should support this person. I should not support this person. They're bad. This is the thing that I should say. And just like slotting these things in a very simplistic sort of way does not enable growth, because it is more about avoiding looking transgressive in public. And it's a lot more about social performance and things like that, which, like, you know, unfortunately is just never something that, one, I've been super good at, and two, something I have any interest in really doing. Is also, unfortunately, the reason why, like, for instance, I struggle to find work, because I just don't really have interest in doing that. Like, if something's wrong, it's wrong, regardless of whether or not someone is my friend or I don't like someone. Like, I have very much said on numerous occasions and carried out that, like, I don't need to like you to fight for you. And I will, and I have. And someone like, is like, yeah, but I supported you. It's like, yeah, and that's why I'm coming to you in private to say that this is not cool what you did. If you were like unkind and just thoroughly someone who I thought that I was not able to have this conversation with, then I would be like reading you for filth on the timeline right now. But I'm not, because of the fact that like I've seen you do just things before, and that's why I'm wanting to come to you and say, this is not it.
Right.
This is like, I don't know what you were thinking, but this is not it. But that is the amount of clemency that someone gets. Beyond that, it's not this thing where, you know, your friendship with me or your relationship with me is a pass for you to not be held accountable in the same way that other people are. But unfortunately, that is not super consistent within the space that we find ourselves. And so that's kind of one of the many, many barriers that we need to kind of dismantle. I am going to run for a bio break real quickly, if that's all right, and I will be right back.
Yes, that works for me. Folks, Vincent is taking a quick bio break, but also we're probably going to wrap up here soon anyway. I've got a whole day of errands that I've got to go on. So I'm going to just vamp here, dance on stream for a little bit while Vince goes and does his thing. How are we all doing this morning? Checking in with folks. I definitely also remember certain toxic people in the TTRPG community encouraging their marginalized friends to act as shields for years and years. Yeah, you see a lot of that. Just vamping and hanging out here, folks. While Vince is gone. This has been great. I hope you all are enjoying this. Bad Quail had pancakes for breakfast. Great. Excellent. Excellent. We are doing a bao tasting very soon. Going to try some bao from a food truck. So that's my life. That's where I'm at right now. I'm very excited about it. Podcast people, if you're listening to this right now, just know that Vince has stepped away and I'm just here filling the air. Will I edit this? Absolutely not. I don't do any editing. I barely cut off the beginning and end of streams. It's interesting, that second thought of the internet slowly moving back to don't trust anyone, don't give out details. From back in the early days. That's what you were supposed to do. Not tell anybody anything. Well, I guess I can talk about next week. Next week I've got Nick Butler, creator of Tidebreaker. Very excited about that. Gonna have him on. We're gonna chat. We're gonna have a good old time. We're both into like super like wacky over the top fighting and combat and stuff. So I think it's gonna be really fun. I mean, conversation about all of that good stuff. But let's see here. For the rest of the month, that's next week. Then we've got Jay, I think, is next. Jay Dragon after that. And I think Sam is coming on after that to talk about a Lumen game. I have to check my calendar. I'm not going to check it right now. But I think I see and hear Vince coming back. Well, hello.
Hello, hello.
I was gonna grab you right beforehand, but I didn't want to interrupt your bio break. I've got to wrap up in the next couple of minutes anyway, because we're going to go do a food truck tasting. We're doing a very small wedding soon, and we're gonna have some bao as the food truck, which I'm very excited
Ooh,
about.
nice.
So I gotta kind of wrap this up here in the next couple of minutes anyway. So, Vince, this has been really, really fantastic. This has been, I want to like continue the conversation. I want to do like part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
I honestly, if there's ever like a week that I'm not working at my day job and you don't have a guest or something, then I'm like, yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk, and like maybe we can talk about RPGs that we like instead of like the industry sucks. All of you people, you're cowards. Like, you know, all of this sort of stuff.
I have to have you back for a second episode anyway, just because I want to know what you're working on, your design stuff, because you mentioned it at the top. I'm like, but what are you doing? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, exactly. This is a continuing problem in my life. It's like, yes, but the capitalists, though,
Right.
like. But yeah, no, this was absolutely lovely, and it was super fun coming on and chatting with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, Vince. As we sort of wind things down here, where can folks find you? I'll go find links and throw them in the chat and make sure they're in like the VODs and everything. But like, where can the good folks find you and support you on online?
Primarily, I am mostly nowadays doing written work over on my Ko-fi, kofi.com/dichotomous prime. I occasionally stream, but a lot of the time it's kind of like, you know, to break up the boredom and like do a little bit of kind of different video content. You can follow me on Twitter. And as well, you can contact me via my email that's in the link tree, as well as on my Twitter at Dichotomous Prime, because I am looking for freelance work. I do mechanical and narrative design, cultural consultation, and also just consultation on narrative and mechanics. I specialize in creating ludonarrative harmony. Basically, if you came up with a thing that you want to make gameplay feel a certain way, but it's not quite fitting that, then like that's what I do. That's essentially my thing that I am probably the strongest in when it comes to that sort of stuff. And just, yeah, we can talk UI, we can talk UX, we can talk like all of the different kind of mechanics and choices of tools. So yeah, those are kind of the main things where you can find me.
Heck yeah, I've seen plenty of people shout you out on Twitter for that very service that you mentioned of like making the mechanics sing in harmony with the intent and the vibe that someone is going with. Like that's very, very cool, right? As a designer to like see the game working with you on on what you want instead of just like this mechanic is one I'm familiar with. I'm gonna just shove it into this scenario and see if it works.
Exactly. And you know, as more people gain that like greater feeling of the texture of like this kind of doesn't feel right, I think that we'll see more of that. I certainly hope to. So
I hope so. I think I am like you, where you said you were mentioning the stuff at the top of just like anybody can be a game designer, and I want everybody to be a game designer, or at least recognize that they have it in them, and just that the act of GMing is the act of design, and so like learn from all.
100%, 100%.
Let's do this thing. Well, heck yeah, everybody, please go support Vince on all of those places. I'm gonna reach out to you about some stuff in the near future now because I've got a couple
Absolutely.
Of
I look forward to it.
And let's see, wrapping up. I think I mentioned it earlier. Next week is Nick Butler, creator of Tidebreaker. Very excited to be talking.
Excellent game, Nick. Yeah, and one of my favorites.
I'm very, very excited about that. I was saying earlier how Tidebreaker, big, like stylistic combat and fun stuff like that. I'm very much into all of that, so I think it's going to be a real good time talking about, I don't know, our favorite fights or something the whole time. It'll be good.
Y'all yeah, absolutely. If y'all come here and enjoy my kind of approach to design things, come here next week and listen to Nick talk. Nick is a good dude and made a really, really good and fun game. So absolutely.
Excellent. It froze for just a second where you said a really, really, and then it was like a long pause, and I was like, a really, really what? A really, really
yeah,
what?
Just like really terrible person. Don't
oh,
no. Nick is awesome. Tidebreaker is an excellent game. The greatest kind of praise that I can give it is that it's been a long time since I found a game that scratches the same cinematic feel of running combat
Mm.
as D&D 5e. Because like there's if you have me back on, I'm gonna do a whole freaking episode on grid maps because I'm big on grid maps and things like that. And I love building like boss fights and things like that.
See, I
Um,
gotta have you on because I want to talk about that stuff too.
yeah, absolutely. No, I'm super down for it. But point being that Tiebreaker was the first game that I played after I decided to not work with 5e anymore
Mm.
that like captured that feeling of like we're going to do ridiculous anime bullshit and like but it's going to be supported by an infrastructure of the mechanics and that was very much Tiebreaker. So yeah, absolutely tune in, talk to Nick, look at Tiebreaker because it's an excellent game.
Yeah, for sure. So that's next week. I think J Dragon is the week after that, and then I've immediately forgotten all the schedule from there on. But we'll be here, same time, same place, here on Sunday mornings for coffee break. Thank you all who have been joining us or listening after the fact or watching after the fact. You all have yourselves a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is you are. We'll talk to you later. Bye,
Have a good one,
everybody.
everybody.